Okay, we're going to do the first part of 0.5. I'm going to use my iPad instead of the smartboard, so that way you can see the calculator as we go through this. Anyway, it says when using a calculator trig functions, it's important that we're in the right setting. In calculus, normally we always do radians. So unless you're specifically told to do degrees, always assume radians. The tricky part will be that some of my classes will use degrees, and so your settings may get changed if you're using one of mine. So let's just review really quick how to do that. If you go into the calculator and you hit the mode button, which is right there, and you scroll down, one of those options is radians and degrees. Oh, just went by it right there. So mine's already set to radians. See how it's highlighted? Make sure yours is also. So this is really tough here. Number one says, what is the sine of 2? Well, you're saying like 2 what? Well, it's 2 radians. Unless it tells you differently, you always assume radians. So I'm going to go 3 decimal places. So sine of 2 is equal to 0.909. Okay, next, tangent at negative pi fifths. Now, we did a bunch of those by hand, right? We evaluated sine, cosine, tangent using those special right triangles. But in this case, pi fifths is not one of those angles, and so we can't do it by hand. We're just going to use a calculator. So again, we're going to come in here. We're just going to go tangent of negative pi divided by 5. Those are negative pi fifths. Hit enter. Comes out to be in negative 0.726 or 7, depending if you want to truncate it or round it off. Okay, this next one's a little bit tricky. We want to find the secant of 1.3. Remember, secant is the reciprocal of the cosine, so you could rewrite it as being 1 over the cosine. Did I say the secant's the reciprocal of the cosine? Hopefully I said that. For some reason it sounds, I'm thinking maybe I said something else, but yeah. So secant's the reciprocal of the cosine. So secant of 1.3 is the same as 1 divided by the cosine of 1.3. So that's how we put it in the calculator. If you notice on here, there's a sine, cosine right there, right? There's a sine, cosine, and tangent button. There is not a secant, cosecant, and cotangent button. Do not confuse sine, cosine, and tangent with the inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent. That's something different. So I'm going to just plug in 1 divided by the cosine of 1.3. And it comes out to be approximately 3.738. Okay, so if you look at these next two problems, it's example 2, we're going to use a calculator to solve them. So when you go to use a calculator to find either a missing side or a missing angle, we use those trig ratios. So I know this angle. That angle is 0.5 radians. I know this side, that's the opposite side. And I know this side, which is the hypotenuse. So I want to set up one of those trig ratios that will allow me to solve it. So you have to decide between sine, cosine, and tangent, like which one is the opposite and the hypotenuse. And that one is the sine. So I'm going to go the sine of 0.5 is equal to the opposite side, which is 5, over the hypotenuse, which is x. I don't know what the sine of 0.5 is, 0.5 radians is, but I know I can plug it in my calculator. But I'm going to leave it just for now. I want to get x by itself. That's what we're trying to find. So I'm going to times by x just to get x off the bottom of the fraction, multiply by x over here. Now we have x times the sine of 0.5 equals, and those cancel out, so equals 5. I'm going to divide by the sine of 0.5. Divide by the sine of 0.5. So those cancel out. So that leaves me with that. My answer ought to be 5 divided by the sine of 0.5. Okay, plug that in our calculator. Our answer comes out to be, our hypotenuse x is equal to 10.429. So set up your trig ratio. Once you have your trig ratio set up, you just have to solve it from there. All right, look at this next triangle. In this case, I don't know the angle, so I'm trying to find the angle. I do know the opposite side, and I do know the adjacent side. So again, pick the right trig ratio that goes with the opposite and adjacent. So that one would be tangent, right? So I'm going to say the tangent of some angle I don't know, so theta, is equal to the opposite side 2 over the adjacent side 5. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, right? We did these yesterday without a calculator, right? When the sine, cosine, tangent was equal to, you knew what the ratio was, and you had to work backwards to find the angle. But this 2/5 is not a 30, 60, 90 or a 45, 45, 90 triangle. Like, that's not the right ratio. So we need to use the calculator. So when you go to do this, if I want to work backwards, right? Working backwards in math is the inverse. So what I do is theta is going to equal the inverse tangent of, theta is going to equal the inverse tangent of 2/5. So whenever you know what sine, cosine, and tangent is equal to, you know the ratio, and you want to work backwards to find the angle, you're going to use the inverse key. Like, I'd put a little note of that in your book. When you're trying to find an angle, that's when we're going to use the inverse, whether it be inverse sine, cosine, or tangent. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to grab my calculator. I know it's set to radians. You have to hit the second key, so I'm going to go second tangent. That brings up that inverse tangent of 2/5, and that should tell me what the angle is equal to. Now, be aware we're measuring this in radians. Sometimes we see the 0.38, and we're like, it seems too small. But this is in radians, so that's why it's such a small number. Okay, so theta, our angle, our answer comes out to be 0.381. Okay, that's my answer in radians. Okay, so using a calculator, things to remember. First of all is make sure your calculator, your mode, is set to radians and not degrees. And also just remember, if you're plugging an angle in, you just use sine, cosine, tangent. If you're trying to find secant, like up here on that C right there, or cosecant or cotangent, then you always need to rewrite it like we did here, right? I rewrote it in terms of the cosine before I plug it in my calculator. And then the last thing is, again, like we wrote down, if you're trying to find, and I think that's off this page there, but if you're trying to find an angle, that's when you use the inverse key. So if I know what the ratio equals, I'm trying to work backwards to find the angle, that's when you do that. Anyway, that should do it for you as far as the calculator section. I'm going to go on and do a separate video for the graphing part.